sure. Anybody's buying, I'm signing.
At least you can do. Get my stuff here.
So should I say something about that? What do you want me to say?
Whatever you want. But I mean, he did study Marxism. And we both think that he should really understand what's going on.
Hard to find those anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, the Modern Times bookstore in San Francisco, which was sort of the more politicized, version of City Lights, the great bookstore there that Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg, among others, founded. I remember going into Modern Times, like, in my 20s, in the 1970s. They had an entire wall of the works of Lenin. And then I went in there. My daughter lived in San Francisco about 6-7 years ago in the neighborhood. I couldn't find one book by Lenin, not one.
And the thing was, they were so cheap. We were always told when to pay cash, never give them a check.
Uh-huh.
The FBI would be after us otherwise.
Who knows when you ran for Congress someday?
That's right.
They'll track it down.
That's right. All right, I'm going to get a brownie.
Should we sit down here? It'll be timing here. So I was I can't remember exactly what you said I should do, but I do what I want to do.
Yeah,
I figure that's
Nice to meet you. My name is Rafael Bell. I used to correspond with Hispanic TV.
Okay.
Very much interested.
Oh, there's coffee out there.
There is. Go get a cup.
So,
Just Karen will set us up. Thank you.
thank you.
Well, as you know, the big thing about this time of this stage in the production of a book is that you're finished with.
All right.
I know you did the Diane Rehm show because I heard that. I thought it was a lot of fun. It's great. Oh, did it? Yeah, that's awesome. But
3 days in a row, I was in the top 50 of the Amazon books, all books.
she said, I heard her show this morning. She said they get 250 books a week.
No.
Well, hello. Welcome to the Economic Policy Institute. I'm Larry Michel, the president of the Economic Policy Institute. We are here today to have a discussion of an important new book by a very distinguished fellow, Jeff Faux, The Servant Economy. And we have some great people to discuss the book. It's my job to just introduce the speakers, and then I just want to say a word. So, first of all, the author of the book, Jeff Faux. What more can one say? It's the man who built EPI, founded it, hired me back in 1987, taught me a tremendous amount of economics and many things way outside of economics that are really, really important, and I owe him an awful lot. And this is his second book completed since he stepped down as being president of EPI, which he did 10 years ago this week. How's it feel? Pretty relaxed. He looks pretty relaxed. And for people to discuss the book, we have Jared Bernstein, who 20 years ago started his work in Washington at the esteemed Economic Policy Institute, and then went on to become the chief economist for the vice president and an advisor to the president, and left a little while ago to go to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and writes a great blog called On the Economy at jaredbernstein.com. What? jaredbernsteinblog.com. Okay. jaredbernsteinblog.com. It's very incisive, witty, and chatty. Very enjoyable. And it's on my Google Reader and should be on yours as well. Harold Meyerson, who I apologize, we misspelled his name a few times. But not today, not today. These are all longtime friends. I don't have any old friends. Harold is, before coming to Washington, was with LA Weekly, and I used to read his columns. Used to come in the mail with the newspaper, and I always thought he'd make a really great columnist. And then all of a sudden, he really did. He came to Washington, became a Washington Post op-ed columnist, as well as his other role in life, which has been working with the American Prospect as editor or editor at large, or his other platform that you can read him on. I wanted to share with you something that's by my desk, outside of my office. You might not be able to read it. It's a picture of a guy in a sandwich board. One thing says, "The end is nigh," and the other says, "The Economic Policy Institute." And it's a cartoon from The Economist magazine, December 21st, 1991. And the person in the picture is a guy with, it's Jeff. It's Jeff. Now, so he's had the idea for this book a long time. And he wasn't wrong then. I mean, there was a period of fast economic growth in the late 1990s, which 5 years of fast economic growth and broadly shared growth. And that period of time stands out as evidence that what we've experienced all the rest of the period of time from 1979 until this year doesn't have to be this way. So Jeff has been, I have been accused, and I probably learned it from Jeff, that things have been bad, things are bad, and things will be bad, which is kind of a depressing message, but it doesn't necessarily make it inaccurate. The thing that we learned about that makes it not depressing is to be able to articulate that although those facts may be true, there are ways to have it be different, and that it is a matter of politics and policy that have actually led to these outcomes. And just to state, I did a paper last year showing that the per capita income growth in the last 30 years, which was something like 60-some%, is matched by the expected per capita income growth by the Congressional Budget Office in the next 3 decades. So the economy has not been broke. The economy will not be broke. There's just a matter of how we govern economic policy, how we govern ourselves, that will lead to those outcomes. And with that, I will let, it's organized as follows, just to say, first Jeff, then Jared, and then Harold. Jeff Faux.
Hi, and Thank you, Larry, for that great introduction. I'm not sure I deserve it. On the other hand, as you can see, I've lost most of my hair, and I don't think I deserve that either. So maybe it all evens out in the end. And I want to thank Harold and Jared for coming to participate in this event, and all of you coming from a town and a time where the future for most people ends on November 6th. So I'm glad to see we've got far-sighted people in this audience. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the future. That's what the book is about. And it's not about what I think has become a small academic and policy industry in thinking about America in the future. And that is the notion, the framework of geopolitics. Is America going up or down? Is China going down or up? Is India going here? Is Japan going sideways? This is not about America in the world. My book is about the future of Americans in America. Now, as everyone knows, no one knows the future. It's a question of probabilities. But if your boat is heading for the rocks and the people in charge of it have decided not to change course, you got a pretty good idea that you're going to end up in disaster. Now, the point of my talk here in my book is, or my talk today, is where do I think we're headed beyond November 6th? What are the chances that the governing class of the United States will change our course? And 3, what are the political implications of that? Now, there's more to the book than this. There's history, psychology, there's the Wall Street crash, there's a treatise on planning, there's Reagan, there's Franklin Roosevelt, there's Ben Franklin, and if you read it carefully, there's sex, romance, and adventure in here, too. But you have to buy the book to get that. So I want to start here with this chart. I hope everyone can see it. I'll get out of the way. This is the only thing I'm going to show. It is what I consider the iconic EPI chart. If you have nothing else in your pocket and you want to explain to yourself and to others the history, the present situation, and I'm going to claim the future of where the American working people are going, it's this chart. Most of you undoubtedly have seen it before. You know the story. Since the end of World War II, wages and worker productivity go up hand in hand, as Economics 101 tells us they should. And then something happened starting in the mid-70s and continuing after 1979, in which productivity of the American worker continued to go up, but wages and benefits adjusted for inflation were flat. Now, economists, as you know, will debate exactly what happened there, why this occurred. Globalization and trade policy, tax policy, the undercutting of unions, deregulation that diverted capital from long-term investment in American jobs and production to short-term speculation, technology, bad schools, obesity, you name it. There's a whole series of explanations for this. And I have my views about which are the most important. But for the moment, the point I want to make is whatever you believe is the cause of this, as you look into the future, the question is that thing going to change? And however you explain this, one thing is quite clear. It represents a weakening, a dramatic weakening of the bargaining position of American labor. And I don't mean just people in labor unions. I mean everyone who works for the living, who works for a living, except those at the very top. Now, when I show this chart, one of the things that come up in people's minds is, well, if this is true, if what EPI has said is true about wages and benefits over the last 30 years, why during that time, from roughly 1979 to 2007, 2008, before the Wall Street crash, why during that time did things look so good? The malls were crowded. People were buying houses. People were buying cars. People were taking vacations to foreign lands where they or their family had never been. So during these years, it did look pretty good. Well, again, there are 100 reasons that people give, but I think the two that are the clearest are the cushions that sustained American middle-class workers during these years were two. One, the family sent more people out to work, usually the wife. Two, an explosive credit bubble, which allowed people to continue to buy, keep their living standards up, even though their wages and benefits were flat. Now, the world we're in now is a world in which those cushions have been deflated. There are more women and men in the workforce. And whatever your guess is about when the next equivalent big several decades long bubble comes back, it's going to be a long time, if ever. So, here's the situation. We've had stagnant wages and benefits, but living standards and income were held up by these two cushions, two props. Kick away the props, and you can make your own projections about where things are headed. Now, another response to this could be, what about economic growth to close this gap? Why can't we accelerate the economy and reproduce what we did in those last few years of the 1990s and have so much demand for labor that wages have to rise? Well, take the most optimistic assumptions for the next 10 or 15 years. Continued growth, meaning no new economic recession, no new banking crisis, despite the fact that you can argue that we haven't solved the problem of banking crises. No new banking crisis. Europe recovers. Now, these are the essential assumptions on the CBO projections until the year 2022. The CBO looks at this, assumes continued growth, and says by 2022, it's 2012 now, just to remind ourselves, by 2022, the unemployment rate is going to reach 5.3%. Now, that seems like a success. Is that going to change this? Between 2001 and 2008, the unemployment rate averaged 5.2%. And still, wages and benefits were flat. It is, as someone writing in the Washington Post this morning said in one of those op-ed columns, it's the new normal. And I think he's right. Now, of course, the reaction to this is, having trouble in the labor force, get yourself a college education. Mitt Romney says, if you don't have the money, borrow it from your mother. Well, maybe. If you could borrow that kind of money, enough money for 4 years in college from your mother, you shouldn't be worried too much about the labor market. However, think about this. During this time, during the time when unemployment averaged 5.2%, the entry wages, adjusted for inflation, of college-educated men dropped 8%. The entry job wages for college-educated women dropped 5%. It is pretty hard to imagine, on the current set of circumstances, market-driven growth accelerating beyond what CBO predicts. And even if you got that, what our experience over the last decade shows us, that it hasn't had an effect on the wages and real incomes of most Americans. The mantra, as you know, in today's political debate is jobs, jobs, jobs. Listen carefully, because the subtext is low wages, low wages, low wages. I assert that we have an economic policy in the United States for dealing with our lack of competitiveness, with our unemployment, with all of those sort of economic problems. And by default or design, pick your poison, pick your motivation, by default or design, what we have is a policy that's attempting to solve these problems with lower and lower wages. A few years ago, Alan Blinder, who was former vice president of the chair and very mainstream economist, made an analysis in which he showed that anything that can be done by a computer can be outsourced and can be offshored. An amazing assertion. It was reproduced by people at the Harvard Business School. They thought actually Alan had underestimated this. Anything that can be done by a computer can be offshored. So, the notion that somehow or other the rest of the world will take the factory jobs and Americans will take the high-level, high-value professional jobs has really been knocked to smithereens. Attorneys, market research, accounting, you name it, and if it can be done with a computer, it's being outsourced. Or if not, it's driving down wages here at home. A few months ago, the President of the United States and the CEO of General Electric went to a GE plant and celebrated the return of the production of a certain kind of water heater from China to the United States. And the op-ed pages and the stories on this was full of this. The country's turned around again. We're taking jobs from China. What they didn't say was that people in that plant in the U.S., that GE plant, used to get $22 an hour. Now they get 12. You know what two-tier wage systems are. It's where new hires get paid 2 tiers. What makes you think they'll stop at 2 tiers? 3 tiers? 4 tiers? It's the same process, right? And he's absolutely right. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does these occupational projections about the jobs of the future. It projected the jobs between 2010 and 2020. Of the 10 fastest growing and largest job categories, 1 was about jobs that required a 4-year college education. 1 was about jobs that required 2 years in college, a 2-year college education. 4 were jobs that did not require you to graduate from high school. Now, have you ever been in an Apple store? Well, you go into an Apple store and you see the future. But the future in the technology, the future of the labor force are all in those smart, college-educated people with the T-shirts whose job is to be a retail clerk for Chinese goods. And we celebrate Steve Jobs and Apple as the epitome of our future vision. 20-somethings putting 2 or 3 jobs together in order to pay the rent and go out and have a beer every once in a while, thinking that, well, this is just temporary. Temporary until I get back on some professional career ladder. Well, you look at the evidence, as opposed to our hopes and desires. Look at the evidence, and those 20-somethings will become 30-somethings, still putting together these jobs, and then 40-somethings. This is not a prediction. This is where the trend is going. This is where the economy is headed. The problem is not, no matter what Mitt Romney or Barack Obama tell you, the problem is not that Americans are not educated enough. The problem is that we're not creating jobs to fit those educated people and to justify the $100,000 debt. Well, it's actually an average right now, about $25,000, $30,000 in debt that they have when they graduate from school. So these jobs, as Blinder suggested, the jobs that are growing and will grow on our current trajectory are personal services jobs. That is, jobs where you need to have a personal connection with people. Not by computer, but by personal connection. So, restaurant workers, retail sales, janitors, receptionists, healthcare aides, teaching tennis to the children of the rich. There are many such jobs in America, but they're not the jobs that people expected as they were moving ahead in America in the past. More people working for labor contractors. You don't get a job, to clean the house or to do a certain kind of task. You don't get a job with your employer. You get a job with somebody that the employer employs. And you don't know who your employer is half the time. And there's no ability to strike. There's no ability to, or little ability to do that kind of thing. Service industry shakeups, the service economy turning to a servant economy. Now, it's not just about wages and benefits. If you look carefully where we're going, this stuff combined with the continual weakening and shrinking of labor unions will return us to a pre-New Deal set of social relations on the job. Now, the boss always has the upper hand. Even in the glory days of the Great Society and New Deal, the boss always had the upper hand, right? But before the New Deal, that hand was a fist. Before there were protections, before there were union protections, and the threat of unionization to those employers who were not unionized. And in those days before the New Deal, life on the job, it was accepted, was often daily humiliations, the kinds of things that are experienced today by today's working poor. Abusive supervisors, dirty and unsafe working places, being ordered around like a child, asking for permission to go to the bathroom. This stuff, if we continue in this direction, is going to spread up the job ladder. As protections peel away, we can see it now. Speed ups. I've got somebody in my family who's a physician's assistant. She's working 12 hours a day. And then when she has a day off, they give her the paperwork to fill out that she was supposed to do on the job. The speed up is not just on an assembly line. The speed up is in the services industry. Cheating on paychecks. Now, when I started to write this book, I made one vow to myself. And that was I was not going to have the last chapter saying, here are my 6 points. Here are my 10 points. Here are my 8 points. I've written several books with that last chapter. And guess what? They haven't accepted my 8 points, my 6 points, or my 10 points. My point here is that we know how to turn this around by now. There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of good books analyzing our situation and providing plenty of policies for turning this around. Investment in real estate, in infrastructure, education and research, trade and tax policies, labor law reform, re-regulation and shrinking of Wall Street to stop the diversion of capital, retiring from our job as world's policemen, common sense health care, which I interpret as single payer. Common sense, right? Okay, I propose that we know how to turn this around. Now, second part of this is, what chance do you think that over the next 10 years, whoever wins this election, the governing class of the United States, which I include the leadership of both parties, is going to do this? To ask the question is to answer it. I'm a Democrat. I voted for Obama last time. I'm going to vote for him this time. I think Romney and Ryan are reactionary disasters. But the last 4 years should have told us something. And that is the power of big money to intimidate the Democrats. I expect a lot of this from Republicans. But we have a two-party system, and one is supposed to balance each other out. We had a huge opportunity that was lost. The conservative economic policies were discredited. Wall Street was on the run. So Obama has got much to account for as far as I'm concerned. However, I also think that he was the best the Democratic Party could offer. So it's not about Obama. It's not even about Obama and Romney, or Obama and Hillary, or whatever your favorite cast of characters is. The current political system, I conclude, will not satisfy anymore the three great American political dreams. The dream of Wall Street and corporate America for unregulated access to unlimited wealth and subsidy. The second dream is the dream of the military-industrial complex for global hegemony. The third dream is the dream of the American working middle class for rising living standards. Now, can we satisfy one of those three? Absolutely. Can we satisfy two? Maybe. But we can't satisfy 3 out of 3 the way we are currently organized. The governing class, including the media, is in complete denial. Washington is dysfunctional, right? I mean, this is the mantra. You turn on the TV, you read it in the Times or the Post or the Wall Street Journal. The problem is Washington and Congress is dysfunctional. Sorry, I think it's functioning just right for them. It's functioning very well. How could it not be functioning well when these guys in Wall Street, who created an economic disaster that deflated $12 trillion out of the economy, are still riding high? How can it not be functioning? If you read Gretchen Morgenson and Floyd Norris in the New York Times every week, they have a story about how, well, the SEC, thought they would bring some of these guys to trial, but decided not to. The SEC was going to have a new regulation, but talked to the bankers and decided not to. How could it not be that it's functioning for them? The grand bargain is sort of the theme of our political life these days in the media. And that is, if only the Republicans and Democrats would get together, maybe after the election, there'll be this force of Tax-mageddon, which will require them to make a deal. Very interesting. But Tax-mageddon or not, the deal has already been made. There will be insufficient money for public investment. There'll be no real regulation of Wall Street, no level playing field for unions, no serious reform of the healthcare monster. Government over the next 10 to 15 years will be starved for revenue. The military will not be seriously downsized. You cannot tell us that the United States must defend any encroachment of China in the South China Sea, by the way. If you look at this map of the world, you find that the South China Sea is very close to China. It's as close as the Caribbean is to the United States. And yet we're not going to let China exert its influence in the South China Sea. that means the military budget is going to continue. Now, you know, I think that this is not a budget crisis. This is a crisis of the governing class of the United States unwilling to take responsibility, real responsibility for the future. The rhetoric, of course, is about the future. Romney and Ryan, I mean, it's absurd, right? They're going to save Social Security in the future. By how? By cutting future benefits for the people in the future. Now, my book, I'm not going to bore you with this, but my book has a sort of a treatise on how Reagan destroyed the capacity of the American government to shape the future. We can go into that in the questions and answer, but I believe that, and the Democratic Party has been complicit. And the symbol of that was, for those few of us old enough to remember, Jimmy Carter, when he was president, put solar panels on the White House, thinking about the energy future. Ronald Reagan became president. One of the first things he did was rip those solar panels out. And gradually, year by year, the rhetoric and the propaganda has undercut the idea that democratic government should have some responsibility for planning the future. Just to say that today invites snickers and laughter and shows that, you know, you really don't understand American politics. So what do we have? What's left? Right now, in this discussion, I feel like the Woody Allen character who says to his audience, he says, brothers and sisters, on the one hand, we have complete disaster. On the other hand, we have sure catastrophe. Let us pray that we have the wisdom to choose between them. Well, what we are left with, appropriately, is hope. It is no accident that Bill Clinton was the man from hope. It is no accident that Barack Obama has the audacity for hope. Hope is a substitute for serious strategy. Somehow things will work out. Push people in this town who are smart on economics and politics and ask them, well, where are these jobs going to come from? How are we going to do this? Somehow or other, it'll work out. This is America, after all. Wait for the recovery. Well, in my view, this is the recovery. We're seeing it now. 8 or 9% unemployment. Hey, we've had it for 4 years. How many more years do we have to have it when we get in our heads that this is it? This is the new normal for the way we operate this economy. Wait for the recovery. And it's not just the elites. People are in denial in America. If you ask most Americans, a majority, do you think the next generation is going to be worse off than this generation? A majority say yes. But then if you follow up that question with, do you think you are going to be worse off in the future? Do you think your kids are going to be worse off in the future? Oh, no, I'm going to be okay. And my kids are going to be okay. Well, they're not going to be okay. And that's the purpose for me writing this book. Hope is not a substitute for strategy, and it's not a substitute for being an active citizen. James Baldwin, the great American writer, once said that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it's not faced. And I think we have come to the point now where we have to face that the servant economy is inevitable unless we have a serious high-wage strategy for America. Now, to do that, you need government to organize it. You need somebody to stand up there and say, hey, this is a big country. it needs a big government to solve its big problems. How in the world do you think we're going to solve these problems with a government the size of Costa Rica? Nobody believes that. But we're not facing up to that reality. There's no trust in government, say the politicians. I can't say that. I can't sell big government because they don't trust big government. Well, you know what? They're right. They're right. Where was their government in the last 30 years? Now, if you ask most people about what they think corrupts government, it doesn't take an American very long to reach the conclusion that it's money. Now, of course, we here in Washington know that the corruption of government is much more subtle than that. It's much more sophisticated. It's not guys bringing in big black bags of $20 bills. And so do most people understand that. But it is money. I vowed I would not end my book with 10 points, 6 points, 8 points, but I do have 1 point. And that is, unless we get the money out, unless we mobilize a politics around getting the money out, unless we use that to educate the American people about what is causing this and the future that I laid out, I think it's inevitable. I won't go into all the, the details about this, but I think we need, after the election, we need a national mobilization for a constitutional amendment that finally rids us of the notion that money is free speech, number one, and that corporations are people, number two. I think that is the heart of the matter. Now, we know that campaign financing is not the only source of corruption. It's, it's for the member of Congress. Where would you like to work after you leave Congress? At Goldman Sachs or some neighborhood community center? Hey, Mr. Congressman, I can get your daughter or your son an internship at a hedge fund. I mean, there's lots of different ways that happens. But nothing is more important than campaign financing, because that is the source of the power that people have to sell out. They have something to sell. So I think that after this election, a campaign like that will allow progressives to create a narrative about government that makes sense. That is, the problem is that your government has been captured by money. People get it. 81% on one poll of Democrats, 71% of Republicans believe that Washington is corrupted by money. Now, when you start talking about changing that system, the smart money, the political consultants say, oh, people don't care about campaign financing. That's what in the old days we used to call a goo-goo issue, good government issue. Who cares about that except a few liberals and law school professors? Well, maybe. But unless we face the heart of the problem, unless our politics aims at where the problem is, the future that I just suggested, I think, is inevitable. What we are like often in this town is like the old story about the drunk who loses his keys in the dark under his car, and the cop comes up to him, and he's under the street light looking for his keys. And the cop says, well, why don't you look in the dark under the car where you lost the keys? And the drunk says, because the light here is so much better. Well, the light here is much better. It's a lot easier to say, well, if we just pass, maybe, if we spend the next 2 years trying to get them to see the error of their ways, if we spend the next 2 years trying to get business to understand that it's in their interest that American workers be healthy, if we only get them to see what we can see, brothers and sisters, they can see it. None of this is a surprise. There's denial, but none of it is a surprise. So I've used up my time here. I'm going to leave you with, I used to live with a story about this. I think it's about this. You judge. It's about the farmer who raised some pigs. And what happens, if you've ever been on a small farm, is you put the feed in the trough, and the big pigs climb in the trough, and they eat it up. And the little pigs can't get at the food. It's a common problem. So the farmer had 3 kids. One son he sent to conservative college. The next one he sent to liberal college. And, of course, the daughter didn't go to college at all. So he says to the kid from the conservative college, he says, okay, how am I going to solve this problem? And his son says, Dad, it's social Darwinism. It's survival of the fittest. The big pigs get the food. They deserve it. Try to make your money off the big pigs, and let the little pigs, whatever happens to them. They starve, they starve. That's the way it is. That's the way life is, Dad. That's what I learned at college. So he said, well, you know, that doesn't seem like a optimal solution to this problem. So he asks his son who went to the liberal college. And his son says, what you do is you just keep buying more feed, and you just keep putting it in the trough, put it on top of the pigs, the big pigs, and some of that stuff will eventually trickle down outside the trough, and the little pigs can get some, finally. Well, that seemed like a very expensive way to go about this. So the farmer asked his daughter how he could solve this problem. And she looked him in the eye and said, get the big pigs out of the trough. If we can get the big pigs out of the trough, I think we can start moving towards a different future. Thank you.
I'm not sure where to start after that. How about those gnats, huh? Before my 10 minutes start, and I will try to be brief because I really want to hear what Harold has to say, and I believe we're going to get, where's Larry? Yeah, we're going to get to questions, if maybe answers. I do want to say a couple words about Jeff and EPI. I think if you were to draw one of those kind of family trees of progressive economists, at the very top of that tree would be Jeff Faux. And you could go down and you'd find Jeff begat Larry, begat Dean Baker, Thea Lee, myself. I see Rob Scott. I know Heidi's here, and Heather Boucher, and John Schmidt. And we don't think about this every day, but I simply wouldn't be here were it not for Jeff Faux. So I think that means a lot to me, and I hope to continue to read Jeff's prolific output and work with him. I also wanted to say, as far as EPI goes, and I'm a former member of the team here, so perhaps I should recuse myself, but I won't. So I could go on in all kinds of ways about all the great things folks have done under Larry's, first Jeff's leadership, then Larry's. But let me just put it this way, and I am not exaggerating. 15, 20 years ago, EPI was talking about things that were generally rejected by mainstream economists and mainstream media as fringy. Now they are conventional wisdom. I am not exaggerating. I can give you many examples on trade, on inequality, on wage trends, on wages and productivity. These were ideas that were not accepted. In fact, these were not just ideas, these were evidentiary ideas, empirical findings that were generally not accepted. Now they are conventional wisdom. EPI doesn't always get the credit for planting that conventional wisdom, but it's true, and I can give you many examples. And in fact, perhaps EPI doesn't quite blow its own horn enough in that regard, but that's, it's a whole other challenge. So if you want to know what people will be talking about 15 years from now, and accepting, read what EPI is talking about today. Okay, now let's begin my 10 minutes. I have to be my experienced politician, as you see. When you're on a panel about a book with the author who wrote the book. I always feel a little bit like I'm reminded of the Gary Larson cartoon where these two kangaroos are at a bar, and this guy's standing next to them, and he's drunk, and he looks at them and says, "Let me tell you a little something about marsupials." So that, because Jeff starts out by saying, this is my book is about the future. And I thought, yeah, I read the thing pretty carefully, and I mean, it's definitely partly about the future, but it's very much about the past. In fact, he goes back to like the 1700s. And one of the things I told Jeff when I first saw him today is I strongly would recommend this book and there's about 100 books about what happened. I found this, and by what happened, I mean, how did we kind of get into the position we're in, what Jeff just took us through for the last 45 minutes. And that history is actually, I think, very important and well told in the book, with not theories and not neoclassical outlines, but actual evidence of how we got to where we are, what happened, both in terms of income, politics, financial markets, and so there are a couple of. I've tried to read almost all of the books on this question of what it just became sort of a fetish of mine, and I thought Jeff's book, along with John Cassidy's book, How Markets Fail, are the best for explaining how we got to where we are. So if you haven't read it, please do. Not just about the future, but about the past and the present. I've often begun my presentations on that theme of where we are, how we got here, and where we need to go, with a theme that I think comes pretty cleanly out of the servant economy, which is that we do appear to have lost our ability to self-correct, to diagnose what's wrong with the economy and to prescribe solutions. Jeff's explanations, if I may summarize, and you can correct me if I get these wrong, but I have a few. I've tried to distill kind of the path that Jeff articulated. The acceptance of neoclassical economic theory as regards trade, budget policy, taxes, industrial policy, and the oversights of financial markets. So the acceptance of a theory that we could talk a lot about, and I could probably draw all kinds of complex diagrams, but at some level it kind of does reduce to where Jeff ended, which is, well, if you leave everything alone, it'll work out okay. So the acceptance of that theory as regards those key areas of our economy is one of the problems. I would add, and this is in the book, this is a key theme of the book, it's where Jeff ended, that the rise and acceptance of neoclassical thinking, particularly a strain called rational expectations, the idea that market actors kind of police themselves and self-regulate, has interacted with a level of wealth concentration that we haven't seen since the late 1920s to block the kinds of solutions, to block the policies that would improve the trends and close the gap there, and to support solutions that make that gap wider. So the reason Jeff's 6 or 8 points, or my 6 or 8 points, or Harold's 2 or 3 points in every column he writes every few weeks, so if you do the multiplication, he's got even more points than we have. The reason those points don't get implemented is because of this very toxic combination between money in politics, wealth concentration, so there's lots of money up there to be in politics, and a broad acceptance of a theory that is very laissez-faire. And when you put those all together, you really have, I think, a good explanation of the problem, and I think Jeff explains it very well. But he also adds something important, which is the lack of an adequate opposition party. So that also looms very large. If there's not a countervailing both story and set of pressures, then we're also going to be stuck where we are. Now, I'm going to provide a bit of a challenge to that. I didn't want to just come up here and be all lovey-dovey. I actually, and I see a few things differently at the margins, and I hope that's useful. But I'm interested in engaging Jeff and Harold and others on that. But I wanted to say so a lot of that, by the way, a lot of everything I just told you, I think is definitely worth reading. I love the way he presents it here. It's not necessarily new. Others have tell this story, though in my view not as compact and convincingly as you have it here. there's something new here that's very, very, very important. I was going to read it, but in the interest of time, I think I won't read much of it. I'll just kind of give you the gist of it and ask you to read it. It's on page 221. It's something I worry about a lot. There is another crash out there. I don't know where. I don't know when. I don't know if it will be another bubble that pops, though that certainly has been the pattern of the last few business cycles. And I worry deeply that because of entrenched wrong thinking about both Keynesian stimulus, which and Keynesian stimulus and particularly financial market oversight, but regulation in general, because of wrong thinking about that, we will be very ill prepared for the next crash. And this is my, end of nigh placard scene. Jeff talks about how the next time Wall Street puts the economy through the ringer, it will be much harder for the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve to clean up the mess. I mean, you may not have loved the TARP or the auto bailout, but they did help clean out the mess. They were very unpopular. Another bank bailout will strain the already thin credibility of the dollar, and the global financial herd will have more places to store its money than in Treasury notes that are once again bordering on default. The Federal Reserve will no longer be able to simply issue more credit without the global markets demanding a much higher interest rate for premiums on the United States. Goes on to talk about the role of China. If China is a dominant economy and we hit the next crash, the conventional wisdom that China will just continue to kind of support us as we muddle our way through may well be wrong. So it's just talking about kind of the global financial constraints. One of the reasons we've done as well as we have coming out of the massive bubble is because we're still considered the safe harbor for global investment. And if that changes, that jacks up interest rates in a way that makes it all that much harder to grow out of it. But I would add, and Jeff doesn't have this in this section, and he should, I would add, if Keynesian stimulus is discredited, then it's a double whammy. I mean, you'll have neither monetary policy, nor favorable capital flows, nor favorable demand-side stimulus policy. So that's really scary. And one of the things that I would encourage EPI to do, and I think few would do it better, would be to think about this and to plan for the next crash with these kinds of possibilities in mind. Okay, now, before I get out of the way, I want to talk about my difference with where Jeff was both in the book and in his talk. I think there's too much here, and when I used to work at EPI, people used to say I was the most conservative guy at EPI, which probably puts me pretty far on the left side of the continuum anyway. So take this with a grain of salt, I guess. If you don't agree, I'd like to hear it. But certainly, I've been someone who's worked very much within the system, particularly as a member most recently of the Obama economics team. But this is how I see it. I don't see, as Jeff described it, the governing class, the leadership of both parties as equal by any stretch of the imagination. I see Democrats and Republicans pretty differently. I think that we need to play a two-level game here, two-level roles. One, making the differences that I'm about to articulate stick and trying to expand them if we can, and two, introducing a newer economic vision of the type that Jeff is espousing. But in the following areas, I think there are big differences between D's and R's right now that if we ignore and just kind of treat it all as well, they're all just the same. We not only do ourselves damage, our movement damage, we actually, I think, hurt working Americans. Taxes. I think taxes are a big difference. I mean, it really is the case that 97% of House Republicans have signed a pledge never to raise taxes, and to my knowledge, whatever the percentage is for Democrats, it's minuscule compared to that. And in fact, we now have a president, and he has not been always consistent on this, but we have a president and a Democratic Senate, at least, who have voted to allow the high-end Bush tax cuts to sunset. Now, in Jeff's very sweeping presentation, which I thought is extremely compelling and generally correct, I understand that this kind of minutiae, but I actually think, I think it is. And I think that breaking the Republicans in Norquist on this tax pledge by having the Bush high-end tax cut sunset would be a very important gain for Democrats and for America. And I know that EPI doesn't disagree with this, by the way, but it's just something that I didn't think came out in the discussion. I'm just going to tick off the list so we can get to Harold. But in the area of taxation, there's dividends. Dividend taxation goes way up in the president's budget, actually from 15 to being treated like ordinary income, so about 40%. International taxation, big differences there. The administration has not gotten behind this idea of territorial tax system that would actually incentivize more multinationals to go abroad. That's deeply ensconced in Romney-Ryan, Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act. I'm loaded for bear on that point. I think the differences on health care are big. On financial regulation, there are differences. In Q&A, we can talk about that. I think that's in my, I'm about to get to a paragraph where I say areas where I think Jeff is right, and FinReg kind of fits in both places. On defense, you're probably more right than wrong, but I think there are some differences. On industrial policy, I guarantee you, well, I should guarantee you, I would be amazed if any Republican president would have rescued the auto companies. I thought that was a huge difference in public policy and in the lives of both those workers and their communities. In clean energy, there's, I think, a big difference. Now, Jeff has some points. There are ways in current public policy where Democrats and Republicans are too close and on the wrong side of the ledger. And EPI has done a very good job on this next one, non-defense discretionary spending. I don't want to go too deep in the weeds on this, but it's kind of the spending, the appropriated spending outside of defense, and so not including all the mandatory stuff. Democrats and Republicans seem to be signed on to decimating this part of the budget, and it's essential. It's an essential part of the budget if you actually care about things that really help people get their lives together, including the kinds of things that enhance mobility, education and training. The White House has always had this kind of sort of advertising point. We're going to get non-defense discretionary spending down to the level it hasn't been since Eisenhower, which I always thought was about the craziest talking point because nobody knows what non-defense discretionary spending is, and I'm not sure anyone knows who Eisenhower is either. But if you read some of the work EPI has done on this, and we at the center have also done work on it, it's an area where I would agree with Jeff. So anyway, I could go on, but I think I should stop. I would only say that each one of those areas that I tried to designate, Jeff and EPI and Larry and others who are kind of ensconced in this fight, as I am, are areas we've got to not only fight to try to achieve the differences that I've tried to articulate, but to expand those differences. So, tax policy is a good idea. While I've mentioned some, I think, very progressive tax ideas that the administration has put forth, one could argue that they haven't fought hard enough for them. And so we should not rest on this assumption that both parties are the same, so screw it. But I want to be very clear. That's one role. That's kind of the inside game. The outside game, the vision of the servant economy, is frankly far more important in the long run. So thank you.
Well, I am delighted to be here. Whether or not this comes out of my 10 minutes, I don't know. But in keeping with what Jared said, there may indeed be a family tree of progressive economists. My position is the guy who feeds off all of it. Much of what I write derives from not only what I read, but from what I discuss with Jeff, with people like Jared and Larry. And I have to say, since Larry, in introducing me, referred back to my prehistoric days at the LA Weekly in the 1990s, reading that stuff as far back as then, this informed my writing about how the middle was falling out of the Los Angeles economy, how a servant economy was growing in Los Angeles, and in this unlikely set of circumstances, how LA was one of the few places where some of those servants actually were able to do something about their lot, that being in the Justice for Janitors campaign and others. But these are exceptions to what Jeff has, I think, very well described as the rule in the American economy. My girlfriend frequently says, when I have lunch with people and they ask me what do I think about how things are going, she said, "Can you depress the hell out of them?" I don't want to add to that chorus here today, but I was asked to talk about some of the politics that come out of Jeff's book, and I absolutely share Jared's assessment that this is a terrific book that also, as Jared said, goes into a lot of things about the past, about what happened in this period here, where the great divergence started to occur. What happened to liberalism and the Democratic Party that this divergence started to occur. I think you'll find very illuminating things in the book. Jeff's, I think, very balanced and fascinating assessment of the Carter administration, dealing with the way in which it was forward-looking and also the way in which it set into motion forces which helped lead to this divergence, which is, I would agree with Jeff, the central fact of the economic experience of the American people over the last 30, 40 years. And so I want to basically flesh some of that out. But before I do that, though, I do want to comment on one thing in Jeff's presentation about the notion that jobs, jobs, jobs is the mantra, and that there's a specific commitment to getting jobs, jobs, jobs because they are low paying. And I just something that I keep returning to, since the administration has cited the work of the Boston Consulting Group, which produced a very influential study last year showing how America is going to get work back from China. They calculated the rising wages in China, the stagnating / falling wages in the United States, and the increased costs of transit and the needs of just-in-time production and so on, and said that by the middle of this decade, this will pencil out, particularly given the higher productivity levels for American business. This will pencil out. It will be economically permissible at one end of the spectrum, actually good at the other end of the spectrum, for us to bring back work from China. Now, I got a hold of the rough draft of this proposal, and what was the one thing that kind of struck me was that it was measuring wage projections in one particular area of China, the Pearl River Delta, one of the highest, an area of one of the highest wages within China, and it was measuring it against the wages in Mississippi. And I wrote a post column on this saying I didn't think most Americans aspired to a future of Mississippi-like wages. And I am relieved to report that when the final draft of the Boston Consulting Group study came out, they had excised the reference to Mississippi and substituted South Carolina. So, if you want to get some indication about the power of the press, I was able to really force that change by virtue of my column. But I want to talk here about where were the Democrats and where were some of the liberals while the gap was opening up. And I would argue, as Tom Edsall argued as early as his terrific 1984 book, The New Politics of Inequality, and as Jeff reminds us very well in The Servant Economy, that you have a shifting balance of class forces within the Democratic Party going on right around then. As Edsall pointed out, then the Democrats by the early 80s were getting as much money from business as from labor The Republicans were getting all their money from businesses. The Republicans therefore had a clearer sense of political trajectory based on where their money was coming from than the Democrats did. Much of the Democratic response to this was, hey, we got to get more money from business. Jeff brings up, I hadn't seen the name in print in quite a while, Tony Coelho, who was major power in the Democratic House, really the guy sort of in charge, the Rahm Emanuel of the time, and brought them significantly closer in alliance with parts of Wall Street and other business communities. The criterion then for if the DCCC was going to back your candidacy, you had goddamn well better be able to raise a lot of money from business. So that switched then. But I would be a little self-critical about all of us then in one regard, because not all Democrats by any means were enamored of what Tony Coelho was doing then in real time. A lot of us had, reservations and indignation about this shift. But I think we did not focus enough on questions of power and on questions of the relative strength of business and labor. The unions since 1960, since the height of the Great Society, have made 4 runs in Congress at trying to strengthen labor law so they could essentially organize workers again. They lost all 4 times. They tried to repeal part of Taft-Hartley at the height of the Great Society in 1965, the same Congress that enacted Medicare, the Voting Rights Act, the War on Poverty. Ken Young, who had been the deputy head of lobbying for the AFL-CIO in that period of the 60s, told me some decades later that the AFL backed 87 bills that went to the Hill in 1965, and only 2 of them didn't pass, one of which being this revision of part of the anti-union Taft-Hartley Act. They tried again under Carter in 78. They tried again under Clinton in 94. They tried again with the Employee Free Choice Act under Obama in 2010. They never got there. There were never quite enough Democrats. There were always just enough Southern Democrats, didn't have many unions in their states, had a lot of business pressure, said no. Meanwhile, you get a real shift in the politics of American business. That's something that as you deal with the class forces in the Democratic Party, you have to realize business isn't a static entity. Its ideology, it's what it thinks it can do and get away with is changing. And to cite one example that I think is particularly prescient now, the New Deal was enacted in part because there were parts of American business that saw the need for higher wages. There were retailing companies that backed this. Edward Filene of Filene's Basement and Filene Department Stores was a major source of support for minimum wage, even unionization. It's very hard to find any part of American business now that believes this. One of the reasons for this, and I think this is something we need to focus on, is that the traditional old, what's called Fordist model means essentially American business pays its workers enough so they can afford to buy the product, a term that goes back to the day in 1914 when Ford Motors started paying its workers an unheard of sum of $5 a day, and if they, in theory, if they made that much money, they could buy a Model T themselves. So it's to about half. So they really don't need American consumers quite the way they used to. I mean, it depends on the corporation, it depends on the product. But this is a huge shift. And therefore, they don't need to pay American workers enough to buy the new Ford, as much as they did, at least, because someone's going to buy it in China, or someone's going to buy it in Northern Europe, or someone's going to buy it in Brazil, or someone's going to buy it in any number of those places. So a certain link has been broken there. But I would criticize us liberals for doing one right thing but not two right things, which enabled this gap to arise. One, the first thing liberals did do in the early 60s, liberalism became centered, understandably and rightly, around the issue of rights, around the issue of individual rights. And our focus became the excluded in our nation, in our society. Civil rights and non-discrimination against people for their race and their gender and their age, and today their sexual orientation. These are triumphs of American liberalism. They've been in many ways a chief focus of American liberalism for the last half century, and understandably so, and rightly so. But there wasn't enough attention paid to the issue of power, something the Republicans have been very good paying attention to. Liberals have eliminated systems of unearned privilege based on skin color and gender and all kinds of things. They haven't eliminated it completely. It's still, in some places, pervasive, but you see the rising trend of the last 50 years. But concern for who was amassing more power in the economy and the society more broadly, which were the kinds of issues liberals also addressed in the 1930s, consequences that I think we are seeing today, with consequences that are manifested in those 4 defeats in labor's attempts to reform labor law so that it is easier to organize. So what is the liberal theory of going forward today, if indeed the economy is going to do what Jeff says it's going to do, which I absolutely believe it's going to do? Well, you know, you talk to people about the long-term future, let's say, of the Democratic Party, and it is suffused with what we might call demographic optimism. The Republicans are, their base is increasingly all white, and much of it antagonistic to the notion of this new multiracial, multicultural America. But that new multiracial, multicultural America, and what's new is at some point, several decades from now, that may become a majority, is the Democrats' hope. That, you know, they can get wiped out in the white working class now that the Republican base's antipathy to these people and the forces that come together when they get together, the Democrats will have a locked-in majority. 2 comments. First of all, I am not convinced that if the economy continues along the trajectory which Jeff and I, and I'm sure many people here believe it's going to continue along, that you can count on these static demographic voting patterns to increase or even persist. The Roosevelt New Deal coalition, let us remember, was partly based on incorporation of new ethnic groups. They hadn't really had that much of a political home if they were voting at all. The Eastern European immigrants who were working in steel and coal in Pennsylvania and Ohio and places like that, you know, they were largely not part of the electorate, in fact, until the CIO mobilized them in the late 1930s. But the New Deal coalition was a polyglot coalition. It was urban, it was southern, eventually it grew to include African Americans. So it had a certain edge of demographic ascendancy itself, if you looked at it. But the other part of that coalition was it delivered economically. It wasn't simply, you know, a rising majority, a rising new America finds a political home. It was a rising majority, a rising new America also finds a political party where it can mobilize and get economic results, get the broadly shared prosperity that this nation enjoyed in the 3 decades following World War II. It seems to me this current theory of a Democratic majority stands on 1 but not 2 legs. It stands on the leg of demographic reorientation, but I don't see where the delivery is. I don't see where the economic performance is. You don't cement a majority simply by virtue of the other guys don't like of a book like Jeff's and the value of the EPI is the clear sense of how this all got out of whack and what it is and how it is that we can deliver. We don't, thanks to Jeff, thanks to EPI, thanks to Jared and people of this very wonderful ilk, we don't lack for the ideas, as Jeff says. We don't lack for the program. We lack for the power. That's why Jeff's ideas on money are absolutely right. It's also why I think in a country virtually without unions, this is going to be very hard to do. I think I've depressed us sufficiently.
So Jeff, did you want to, any comments before we open it up?
Just a couple. I agree with Jared that there are differences between Democrats and Republicans. As I think I said in my book, or I should have said in my book, it's the difference. I mean, here we have Democrats, I think, on the cusp of accepting large chunks, large cuts in social programs and public investment over the next 10 years. But a cut is one thing, destroying it is another. And so there's a difference in the world between having a Social Security check that might not increase with the cost of living, or having cuts in Medicare benefits and having no Social Security and no benefits. There's a difference between having a weak union movement and having a no union movement. That's why I'm a Democrat. However, it is not enough, in my view, to make a difference in where we're going. And so I just want to make that clear. A point about, well, 2 points about what Harold said. On the question of rights and general opportunities, Elaine Bernard, who may still be head of the Harvard labor movement,
Harvard Trade Union Program.
She once had a line that I have to reference her. She has a line. She says, "They can't fire you because of your gender. They can't fire you because of your race. They can't fire you because of your sexual preference. They can't fire you because of your religion. They can just fire you for no reason at all." And so I wanted to add that to, but also the last point about the wealth, I think is important. And here is where I think another place where the Democratic Party has, by accommodating the rhetoric and the ideology of the right, has misled its own constituency. The President of the United States has said more times than I can count, I don't care if people get very, very rich and become billionaires and get as much money as they want. I don't care. Well, I care, because the way it works is when you become a billionaire, you not only have more money, you have more political power. And Barack Obama knows that. If he was here and, there wasn't any press, he would say that. Of course I know that, Jeff, the rich. But unless that becomes a rallying point, unless the Democrats are willing to deal with that question, and that is that wealth equals political power, then I'm afraid we're not able to, we'll never be able to mobilize the kind of political consciousness that we need. And that's the problem now. Americans, I believe, looking at the polls, really don't think it's that dire. Really think that somehow things will get better. The elite keeps saying somehow things will get better. Democrats didn't believe that it was important enough for them to get originally the budget and some other stuff done to break the Senate break the Senate filibuster. So Democrats are with us. As the previous Democratic president said, I feel your pain. I have no doubt that he feels the pain. But feeling the pain is not enough.
Okay, we're going to take 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll, again, I'm going to take them all at once, and then we'll let people go. So Pat first.
Quickly, in your book, I noticed that you talk about national security has been justification for doing some important things, highway systems, space program. Now, you mentioned the South China Sea. It's so clear to me that China has a vision of creating its comprehensive national power, and you build that by economics, and then comes your military and political upon that. And that our policies have assisted China in building its comprehensive national power, and now we're going to put our military there, but continue the policies that help China build its comprehensive national power. Can we not use this national security issue to shame our corporations into some more responsible behavior on the China issue?
Let's take the press right here.
Mark Ruhenberg of Press Associates Union News. I'm going to posit this to you, Jeff. You aren't going far enough. To go back to your pigs at the trough, it sounds like the problem is basically not having 2 troughs, but cutting down, putting those big pigs on a diet. And the question is, how do we put the big pigs on a diet?
Yeah, wait. Take this, and then we'll.
I'm Basil Scarless. I've lived and worked in Europe most of my life, and one thing that's impressed me is how easily they can fund public investment through the consumption taxes that they have, which we don't really have. Do you think, and the compensation rates, if you would have had in the past decade or 2 decades a more reasonable amount of public investment than we have had in the past? We need to shift from consumption expenditures to investment expenditures. And yet we don't even have a public investment budget. We don't distinguish that in our budgetary stuff. The other thing is, and just very briefly, I find it amazing that the president doesn't come up and explain in a few sentences Keynesian economic theory and why that would be so. Is it so hard to explain to the general public, number one, or is the public just unreceptive?
Okay, hold on. This woman will go back there on the left, and then.
Hi, my name is
That's for
Mindy
Jared,
Reiser.
say that question.
I'm a sociologist. I'm also on the board of the Labor and Employment Relations Association here. On the one hand, you've talked about the fact that you are a Democrat, you will vote for Obama. On the other, you seem to see a real impasse. What are the options in terms of an independent third party, or will that really throw everything to the dogs?
Good questions.
You've done that already.
How about we just take those 2 over there, and then we'll stop. Right here. Yeah.
Christopher Watson at the National Science Foundation. I'd like to hear your prediction on what the effect of about 8% unemployment would be if it held over the next couple years on the politics for the issues that you've talked about.
I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. I'm a physician and an attorney. I graduated from college in 1969, and what distresses me is something no one has talked about, and that's the change in public attitude. The most upsetting thing about the auto bailout was the resentment of ordinary workers that GM workers had quote-unquote Cadillac benefits, or the resentment of public workers in Wisconsin. The only reason they still have a union is because the state can't do illegal stuff the way a private company can.
Okay, why don't we let Jeff, and then we'll let the Jared and Harold go, too.
I thought those were just great questions, by the way.
The first one was about can we shame the corporations into feeling more patriotic and therefore economically loyal to the United States. You know, Pat, we probably could have in the past, And we did, in a sense, in World War II. You know, in World War II, there were large parts of the business community that was not enthusiastic about war production and an accommodation with labor. They had to drag the president of Montgomery Ward out of his office. Roosevelt had to do that. But by and large, there was a sense that, well, patriotism also means more profits. And it's hard for me to see, even in our past, where the shame of it all would make our CEOs see the world differently, especially from what, given what Harold, the point that Harold made, which I think is very critical, and that is these people do not see themselves as CEOs of American institutions anymore. 20 years ago, it must be, I heard a vice president of the Ford, 20 years ago, I heard a vice president of the Ford Motor Company who was testifying in the Senate saying, oh no, Senator, let me just correct you on that. Ford is not an American company. When we're in America, we're an American company. When we're in Brazil, we're a Brazilian company. When we're in Germany, we're a German company. I think that what's happened over this period, and this is where the trade thing, I think, is even more important than the money, than the deficit. And that is, it has shifted the perspective of the people who run our largest economic institutions from the concerns about America's future to something they think is the global future. And that's different than Henry Ford. That's different from Carnegie, as much of an SOB those guys were. They understood that their future was in America, and they needed the workers, and the workers needed them. Now, labor management conflict is quite different. So, as much as I'd like to bring you some good news, Pat, and say, yeah, I believe that, you know, if we just pointed out to them that they weren't being patriotic, I don't believe that. I think they're going to do what, I think the only way to change them is, oh, pick, yeah, put them on a diet. Well, I'm for that. That's, but I think you got to get, the metaphor of getting them out of the trough, I thought that was clear, but I think what's got to be broken is their political power, and I don't think you can break it, unless you go at it directly, which is why I think it's so important to go after this campaign financing issue. I'd like to believe that, after all, for 2 years, we had a Democratic president, we had a Democratic House, we had a Democratic Senate. For some months, we had a filibuster-proof Democratic Senate, and it didn't happen. And I've been through this enough to say the answer can't be, oh, if we had somebody else than Obama. If only we had elected Hillary. If only we had elected, I don't believe that anymore. I think it's deep now, and the money is too deep for us to think that way. All right, quickly, consumption taxes. Yeah, the difference in Europe is consumption taxes were part of a social contract. That is, people pay the taxes for their social welfare program. Here, consumption taxes are being proposed by the right, not as a social contract, but simply as a way of reducing the income tax and corporate taxes. So yeah, I could see I can imagine a social contract in the United States that said, okay, single payer, Swedish style society, it'll be worth consumption taxes. But we have a long, long way to go before that. Okay, third party, having been involved in an effort to create a third party on the left one time in 1980. I've just got too many scars on my back to believe that that can happen without one or the other of the major parties collapsing. I think how we got the Republican Party, my history may be wrong on this, but I think it was the collapse of the Whigs that created the Republican Party. And maybe to answer the next question, what happens with 8% unemployment if it continues and continues and continues, then maybe the Democratic Party is going to have to face its moment of truth or fade. And at that point, I think what will happen is that people on the progressive side of the Democratic Party and independents and people in the Tea Party who think that government is corrupted by money will form something new. But I don't see that. Maybe in my next book I'll have more courage about looking into the future. Finally, the Cadillac benefits and working people against working people. This is an old strategy, and let us not think that it's just by accident that this right-wing propaganda campaign is trying to divide the working class. Jay Gould, who was a financial racketeer of the last part of the 19th century, once said, "I can hire half of America's working class to kill the other half of America's working class." That's how they think.
I should say before we go to Jared and Harold that there are books for sale outside at a 15% discount, and Jeff is going to stay here and sign every one that's bought.
All right.
And Jared and Harold, you never got around to point 2 about why there's against demographic optimism.
You're just showing that you listened.
Yeah, so I want you to, well, maybe you'll go first, and then I'll let Jared wrap up.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. What is? Well, I think that's because by the time I got to it, I'd forgotten what it was.
Okay.
Okay. But I want to go back to this.
Time to think about it. You want Jared to go first?
No, it's okay. I want to go back to this politics of resentment business. A lot of the problem is that there is in the public sector still. People went into public sector work once upon a time, not because it had any advantages over private sector work. In fact, it didn't. What's happened, of course, is a two-tier version of breaking unions, and it turned out to be much more easy to break private sector unions than public sector unions for reasons that the level of employer opposition in the private sector grew to be near universal, whereas in the public sector, usually there wasn't that level of opposition, certainly not while Democrats governed, and until recently, Republicans were not quite on the warpath the way they are now. But we are now in a situation where if you're looking at not Cadillac benefits, but who has something like defined benefit pensions, increasingly you only find that in the public sector. And the political problem, obviously, is that private sector workers who don't have those kinds of benefits, once they did, now they don't, are paying taxes to public sector workers who still have preserved them. So, I mean, one of the questions coming out of this, you can understand how management and Republicans can see this as a wedge issue. It's a ready-made wedge issue. But for all that we look at Wisconsin and have a kind of appalled reaction, when we look at Ohio, which was more directly the case, and where John Kasich, the Republican governor, repealed collective bargaining rights, unlike in Wisconsin, also for police and firefighters, I think a real key here is putting a human face on the abstraction of public employees. People think that cops and firefighters really deserve what they get. And there have been campaigns in California against a Schwarzenegger ballot measure about 6 years ago. that also was not exactly on this, but directed at weakening unions. And the campaign against the Schwarzenegger measure focused on nurses, teachers, cops, and firefighters. When people remember that these are people, these are average people, these aren't elitists in any way, shape, or form, there's still enough humanity and solidarity there that you have a fighting chance, I think, to beat this. But the assault's going to continue. Jay Gould is still with us, and it ain't going to be easy.
I just have a few additions to Jeff's answers. I thought he went through all the questions and I agreed with much of what he said and don't have much to add. I have a couple of things. Pigs on a diet. There's one institution that I think can help here, and that's the foundations. And this is just sort of by way of information. The philanthropic foundations that fund organizations like ours, and they often have difficulty weighing into areas of sensitive public policy, which can be unfortunate because those areas often need that kind of philanthropic support. There is a nascent movement, or at least an interest, among the foundation community to try to do something about money in politics, which is recognized by them as not a right or left issue, which is convivial to the kind of constraints I talked about, but something that's just undermining democracy. So I take that as a sign of hope, and I know for a fact that some foundations are developing programs in that area. I think the problem in terms of the pigs is the Supreme Court, and that doesn't change quickly. And so I think it's a long-term haul. On public investment, you mentioned you talked about, Jeff addressed your question in terms of the VAT or a consumption tax. But you also asked, would that help? Would more public investment help in kind of closing this gap? Perhaps surprisingly, given my orientation, which is very favorable towards more public investment and public goods in particular. I actually worry about the quality of America's public goods, both in terms of infrastructure and education. I actually don't know that it would help all that much with the gap. At least as an economist, when I think about public investment in public goods, I think, and EPI actually was doing work about this 20 years ago, I think about that as an input to productivity. And I think it's something that actually will hurt America's growth if we fail to make those investments. But as long as productivity is divorced from median compensation, it's not obvious to me that more public investment solves that particular problem. Now, if there's investment in infrastructure, which creates more jobs for people, increasing their employment, lowering the unemployment rate, producing somewhat more bargaining power, maybe. But I think that's important. I think we should do it. I don't know that it does much in terms of gap closing. Keynesian, why hasn't Keynesian economics been better defended or better accepted? Well, you mentioned, I think it was you who mentioned the lack of public receptivity, and I think that's big. Look, the way it goes, and certainly there's been lots of noise from conservatives on this, you implement an $800 billion stimulus package and the unemployment rate goes up, game over. Right? Because people don't do counterfactuals that say, well, it went up less than it would have otherwise. So it was very easy, I think, for opponents of that sort of thing to say, well, clearly it didn't work, when in fact there's lots of evidence from nonpartisan sources that it worked well. You can very much argue, and I would say, perhaps I've been part of the problem, that folks either in the administration or associated haven't done a good job of defending it, and we could talk about that. There's a very important and good new book out by Michael Grunwald called The New Deal, which does a really good job of explaining what actually happened in the stimulus, and it's a very favorable, I think, look at it. But there's a way in which Democrats have hurt have made this problem a lot worse, particularly around public receptivity, and that's by talking about belt tightening. One of the worst, most damaging, folksy analogies you can make if you're in the federal government is to say, hey, families are tightening their belts, therefore we have to tighten our belt too. That is patently wrong, upside down, backwards. In fact, when families are tightening their belts, that's when the federal government, which has the capacity to run budget deficits in a recession, should be loosening its belt, and vice versa. When they're loosening their belts, we should be tightening ours. So getting that wrong has hurt us. That's a self-inflicted wound. Finally, on the 8% unemployment, I agree with Jeff's answer, and I just want to amplify it a bit. If we had persistent 8% unemployment, that would imply that the economy was persistently growing at rates that were subpar. So 1.5, less than 2%. That's just how the macro would work out there. And I think that would lead to basically a cycle of throw the bums out. They're not, this party isn't working, so let's get them out. Next party isn't working, let's get them out. And maybe Jeff's right. Maybe that kind of evolves towards something better because there's an opening. If nobody's fixing anything, maybe there's an opening for someone who can.
Although that, to a certain degree, is what's gone on in Europe over the last couple of years. We haven't really seen the savior emerge yet in any European nation.
That's instructive, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's say thank you very much to the speakers. And people can line up over here to get their books signed. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Harold.
Thank you, both, all three.